he was quite a small man. He wasn't very large and tall and imposing and anything like that. He commanded a room by the presence of his thoughts, not by the presence of his stature.
I suppose if I were to pull a name out of the air like Rudolf Arnheim, many people would not know who he is, much less his theories, ideas, habits. Visual thinking was Rudolf Arnheim's creation, his child. Many of us are familiar with the act of perceiving an object, a work of art, a pipe, shall we say, and then separating that experience from the next, which is thinking about said object. Only after perceiving something do we begin to think about it critically. Arnheim rejects this idea. From his time in Germany, he was engrossed with the idea of perception and thinking being one and the same. To make this more clear, let's look at Arnheim's presentation of the 4 images of freedom. In these images, the arrows take the form of free will. From the first image to the second, we see that free will becomes more whimsical. But free will is incomplete without the perception of the environment, so in the third image, a second group of arrows take the form of the environment. A clash is represented here. This clash is the conflict between perception and thinking as we see them today. What we perceive may contradict something that we were taught to believe. And that is why Arnheim's theory is represented in the 4th image. Environment and free will work together to contribute to a symbiotic relationship between thought and perception.
For me, that argument is very cogent. And when I think about it, I often do think about it on my own. I think, yeah, that's right. I think I incline, when I'm trying to work through a difficult idea or a difficult thought, I think I do naturally, instinctively translate it into visual terms.
Like countless others, Rudolf Arnheim emerged a Jewish intellectual who fled from the grasp of Nazi Germany in 1933. This was just after the publishing of his first book, Film is Art. As the Nazi movement had yet to gain momentum into Italy, the distinguished psychologist and writer felt that he would be safe developing his theories on gestaltism and visual perception in Rome. It was this time living in Italy that would eventually lead to Arnheim's extensive relationship with Peg Boyers, wife of Robert Boyers, the editor of the Salmagundi magazine some 30 years later.
For themselves, they were very brilliant and gifted, and in some ways, the cream of German artistic and intellectual life, fled Germany. And Arnheim was one of them. So I was doing this big volume on German refugee intellectuals, and inevitably I wrote to Arnheim.
I didn't really get to know him until the early 80s really well. We had a little conference, and there was a photograph somewhere of us together at that conference, and he was already 80. And it was in 1985, something like that. And he came, and we discovered that we had this mutual passion for Italian, which translated into a kind of deep love for each other. And we started writing Italian because we both missed it so much. So we have this very sweet correspondence, which, is like, these are just many, many letters.
My wife came up with this idea, for doing something regular, for him doing something, if not every issue, at least most issues, and between her and Arnheim, they sort of came up with this Snippets and Seeds.
Well, that just evolved. I wouldn't take credit for it. I think, he sent them to us, and, I was excited, and, I talked about them to him in Italian, Semi Ritalie, which is, there's no such thing, but that was our title in Italian. And so, yes, they were very eccentric. Some of them were about music, some of them were about art, some of them were just about the way people behave.
Arnheim's Snippets and Seeds are complementary to his theories about visual thinking. Both value a system in which the artistic theme is reliant on the comprehensive experience. The fleeting nature of the seeds mimic a human thought process. We think with preoccupation and fragmentation. This is what the Snippets and Seeds do as they delve into a topic with a flaming commitment before they end just as quickly and suddenly. There are 4 recurring topics that Arnheim continues to return to in his snippets. They are the innocent mentality of children, the evaluation of language, the position of religious experience on the world, and visual awareness and visual blindness.
Then he's always stressing a visual astuteness of children that somehow we have lost. We've lost in the way we deal with our lives. Arnheim was against pure verbal thinking. If you move into the world of pure verbal thinking, you are moving ultimately into a world that is hermeneutic, that no one else will understand. And that's very important. If you think of the Eucharist as the transformation of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, you reduce it to simply a superstition. And I think that's an important word, superstition, because this is not a religious argument that should leave you by the wayside. He's thinking beyond the idea of the confines of religion. And then, of course, he talks about his own, if you will, his own visual awareness and blindness, that he's working out an idea and he's walking around and he's walking through a suburban neighborhood, as I remember, and he forgets that he's walking through the idea itself, that the visual world is so important. You can't be blind to the visual world.
Arnheim had an ability to articulate his ideas scientifically and artistically well enough to please 2 worlds. His background and interest in art history and psychology fit well into what the Salmagundi magazine strives for. Salmagundi compares the playful nature and artistic elements of the seeds to its simultaneous aspects of the human psyche. It is both the beauty of his writing and the vast, intricate ideas that we encounter in the seeds, along with Peg Boyer's, of course, that led to his extensive relationship with the Salmagundi magazine.
In his old age, he's very infatuated with romantic poetry, and of course with the great tradition in the visual arts and so on. He's got a really passionate relationship to the arts in a way that you don't often associate with a scientist. I mean, after all, Arnheim wasn't a scientist. He was a psychologist, right, with very technical training, and yet, you know, when you read him on the arts, you can tell that it's not just the perspective of an art lover, but the perspective of someone who in some ways is so inside the work of art that you associate it with the perspective of the maker.